So Dr. Arnold, I'm extremely honored and privileged to be introducing him. He is my chair on my committee and also my advisor and mentor. He has been a faculty member here since 1993. He co-founded the TAMU Teaching Gardens and worked on it as a founder for 20 years or director for 20 years. And now he is the director of the Leach Teaching Gardens as well. If you haven't read his summary of his recognitions and accomplishments and publications, please do so. The summary is longer than most of our CVs, so he's done quite a bit. But with that, I'll let him come and talk. Dr. Arnold.
Thanks, Jonathan. You're not going to tell him what my favorite accomplishment was in 29 years?
Not being
Not being convicted of anything. All right. Well, thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'll get there. I want to make sure I've got the voice here first. Okay. And I need to see if my folks online are able to hear me, hopefully. All righty. That's all right. We'll get there. Duplicate, go into the. Okay. All right. So you have to go to.
I've had an issue if this has been on, so I had to turn
I shouldn't be off. I should be off.
I had the same problem in classes.
Yes, because if the last person used this, then you're. Do you mind if I just do this?
Oh, yeah, try that first.
Yep, try it.
Here we go.
Right now.
There we go. We're good. We're live.
All right, now. Put it back on present.
I get that. Okay. I think we're ready to go at this point. This is a great opportunity to come and visit with you. And this has been an incredible week. I don't know about anybody else who's been teaching, but the fact that folks are coming to class, they're enthused, they're excited. It's just unbelievable. So everybody give yourself a hand. You survived 1.5 years of COVID. All right. So we're going to talk about public gardens and resiliency. And one of the things that I want to do is try and set a tone for the semester in that we have a lot of speakers coming in on public gardens about things. So rather than try and delve into all of those educational aspects that a number of them will be presenting, I know the person following me, Dr. Bergner, will talk about human interactions. I want to kind of set and make a case for the fact that climate change is going to have a major impact on the built environments in the next few years, and that public gardens have a role in trying to increase the resiliency of society to those issues. Some of those things you'll all be familiar with: global warming, some of the issues with changes in precipitation patterns. There's a lot of other aspects that are going to impact built environments, particularly from a horticultural or a landscape perspective, that we need to be aware of. We want to talk about what some of those implications are going to be, not only to built environments, but to other aspects of horticulture. And then more importantly, what kind of things can we begin to do to try and adapt to that? And what is the role of public gardens in perhaps addressing some of those issues? So first thing is, as we all go out, climate change is not global warming, okay? Yes, it has to do with long-term changes in weather and precipitation patterns, et cetera. But really what we're looking at are changes. And I liken it to if you are a grower and you have a yield of 15 units per given input, you can have that and have a variation in that yield of plus or minus 1 unit, or you can have a yield of plus or minus 5 units. Okay. Now, which one is more of an issue is the one that's going to have that variation, right? Okay. If you're a grower, you're worried about that. Well, if we're growing landscapes, then we're also worried about not only what the mean changes are going to be in some of these weather and precipitation patterns, but what's the variability about them that is associated with it. Okay. So just to look at one of the big things we're worried about with variation is major disruptions that we're going to deal with. And if you look at this information here, what you're seeing is a chart that spots each one of these spots on here is $1 billion plus weather-related event in the US over the last
Sorry to interrupt, but we lost audio.
of the urban heat islands versus, we got it, versus the surrounding areas. And they found as much as 27 degrees difference on a single day in that. Isn't that incredible? 27 degrees difference in the temperature from the surrounding area to the center of the urban heat island. Now that was very dramatic, but on average, on any given day during the year, it was on average 2.5 degrees warmer in the urban heat island during the day. And what was more worrisome, we've got her going. What was more worrisome was that we didn't cool off as much at night. So we were actually getting a 4-degree average increase in temperature at night. We'll talk about some of the implications of that in a bit. It also meant that we were more frequently exceeding 90 degrees centigrade. And you might say, well, what's magic about 90 degrees centigrade? That's just warming up here in Texas, right? Well, the truth is that many times respiration continues to increase with increasing temperature, and photosynthesis tends to cap out about 90 degrees. And so at that point, it begins to decrease and become less efficient. And so we're actually burning negative carbohydrates at that point. They found on average that we got 8 days of more than 90 degrees on average that were added on to the season. And some cities were reporting as much as 20 days. OKC, not far from here, was 22 days. The other thing is, as we raise those temperatures, we also are raising the source of pollution in terms of ozone. And that can have an impact on human health as well as on plant growth. They also did one that was specifically on a smaller city, Madison, Wisconsin. Doesn't sound like it had much of a heat island impact, right? Kind of like the Aggie Dome here in College Station is our heat island impact. And what they found there was that over a number of years, they increased the length of the growing season by approximately 5 days. Now, if you're from Wisconsin and putting up with the snow, you probably didn't mind that increase in 5 days. But if your plants, and depending on where that's coming, it may impact your acclimation or deacclimation period going into the winter months. So it could have an impact there on the landscape. Not all aspects, everything has a silver lining, right? Wisconsin gets an extra 5 days of growing season, but also there have been reports of reduced winter heating in buildings due to urban heat islands. So I guess that's a cost savings or energy savings. And of course, those of us who like to get on the edge with our plant selection in the landscape can use that as microclimates to try and grow something a little different that wouldn't normally make it there. Although we can get busted on that, like we saw this past winter. So what about precipitation? Well, I thought it was unusual to find that precipitation is, generally speaking, anticipated to increase worldwide. And at first I thought, well, gee, maybe that'll offset some of the negative impacts of increased temperature. But the truth is that it's predicted to be highly variable by location. And so the odds of creating additional drought in certain areas or excess water can become a problem. One of the examples was the southwestern US is one area that's predicted to continue to become drier in climate change. And it was particularly disturbing to think about this because if you look at the research from tree rings and other ways to estimate climate in the past, geologically, we were in one of the 100 wettest years in that geologic scale. So are we going back to normal? Or are we going back to drier than normal? How's that going to compare with the moisture we had there and the large populations that are in the urban environments in the southwestern US? If we look at what the projected demands for water are, it also will have an impact on what's available for us to use in landscapes. The one on the left is the projected increase in demand over precipitation and available resources, given just growth from our population, agriculture, industry, et cetera. With climate change, is the one on the right. And you'll notice that virtually all of the US, except for a small part of the Northeast, is likely to be at deficit levels in terms of water needed. One of the big concerns, particularly for us in the southwestern US, is a depletion of aquifers. This is the Olagua aquifer that runs from West Texas up through Nebraska. This is based on historic declines that occurred in the late 80s and 90s, and how many inches the water has, or feet the water has moved down in the strata before you can get to the water. I'm sure it's even worse now, but this is something facing all of the areas that are dependent on the aquifers for irrigation. This is going to have several implications for urban areas. One, a conflict potentially between agriculture and urban environments, but also it's going to be an increasing dependency on built environments, the irrigation to come from tertiary water sources. And so having plants that can withstand and handle those are going to be a serious concern. One of the things that we've not paid a lot of attention to in the nursery and landscape industry is the provenance of the plants. In other words, what is the original genetic background? What environment did it come from? We talk about seed source, but that's just where you happen to pick the seed at. That could be from any original genetic source. And so what we're finding is that actually makes a difference on the adaptation to the plants and some of the environmental stresses we're dealing with. Here you see a regional selection of possum haw, and this is during the 2010-2012 drought that occurred, and this is at the old garden. So this is one that is a native selection from our region in possum haw. This is a selection of bald cypress from a western provenance in this geologic range. These are plants from a more mesic climate. This is Warren's red possum haw, and this is an eastern provenance of bald cypress. Same site, taken at the same time, but the only difference was where the genetic materials came from and what they were withstanding in the drought. Okay, so going to be a major issue for us as we go forward. In addition, there's complications of how do these rising temperatures interact with potential pathogens. One of the problems comes in with insects, and there's reports in the literature that for every 1 degree rise in centigrade temperature on a worldwide basis, we're expected to lose between 10 and 25% of the grain production. Okay, that's really scary, but you say, well, that's not horticultural crops, and what's that got to do with the built environment and landscape? Well, there was actually an interesting study that was completed about a year ago at Michigan State, where they looked in a controlled environment at the impact of increasing temperature on insect metabolism and growth rates, as well as the physiology and growth of tomatoes and yield. And what they ended up finding was that the insects actually liked the warmer temperatures. They grew faster, they ate more, they predated more on the tomatoes. As we got additional predation, the plants were forced to shuttle more of their photosynthates into the production of defensive compounds like jasmonate, and also were, with the increasing heat, putting additional resources into other physiological aspects of dealing with drought and warm temperatures. Bottom line is photosynthesis was impaired, plants declined, and we got a reduction in yield. So we're not operating in a vacuum. All these things are going to interact. You might say, what's happening a little closer to the landscape? Well, this is a beautiful native tree. Y'all like that? I don't know why we don't plant more of that tree. That's Eve's necklace, nice native tree that we have here. This is in a built environment at the beginning of the drought. This was one 2 years later after we turned off the irrigation on it. Okay. You look at that and you say, wow, that's in decline. And I thought it was in more decline than what the native ones were in the population. So we started investigating some of the plants in the area that were declining. And what we ended up finding was that these winter temperatures that were milder and the dry conditions were favoring borers. And so we're finding on oaks, we're finding on a number of species that borer damage is going along with this and increasing the losses in our urban forests. Okay. So winter matters, but what about summer heat? What about winter chilling? So as we look at warming climate, historically, we see this is the breadbasket of the horticultural areas of California. This is the Central Valley. A lot of our produce is coming from there, a lot of our fruits that we see. And of course, the wine industry is centered in that area. And we're seeing a change in the amount of typical winter chilling that has historically gone from 1950 to 2000. It's projected to continue to be warmer and fewer chilling hours. As a matter of fact, as we get into those lower chilling hours, many of the traditional fruits and vegetables that we grew in those areas will not receive sufficient winter chilling to produce crops well. So another major concern. Not only that, but we're losing the length of the chilling units that we're getting and getting them interrupted more during the winter. So what we see here are the length of cold snaps in number of days and whether those have stayed the same or increased over the last about a 30-year period there. And what they found is that the length of the cold periods are reducing. So not just the total cold, but we're getting it interrupted more as we go through the winter as well. This is just a personal experience. We were growing some plants for a bioswale project with some students here a couple of years ago. These are buttonbush, a local species, Cephalanthus, that grows in moist environments. And we had collected seed locally and grown them up, and we realized we didn't get quite enough germination. So I called a friend of mine in a colder climate and got some seed that they'd collected and brought it down. They grew out in the nursery just fine the first year, all of them. But then when we put them into overwintering habitats and waited, this is August the next year on the ones from the northern area. We happened to have 300 hours of chilling that winter. Our native ones broke bud and continued to grow. We planted them out and they're fine. But this is what happened when we had inadequate chilling. Plants are perfectly healthy. They just never broke bud. We also are seeing reports of the same thing. I got calls from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. This is on thornless honey locust. And I know probably Jonathan's going, oh, wait a minute, we teach that one. It's out there in the landscape all over the place. That's the thorn variety. The thornless honey locust varieties have typically been selected from more northern locations, have inherently higher chilling requirements. And so they typically are not grown in this part of the southern US. And usually in Dallas, they got away with it. That year, they didn't. Inadequate chilling being a problem. Same thing was reported on Chinese fringe tree cultivars from cooler climates. So if all this is happening because we've got increased temperatures and less chilling going on, what in the world happened last year? Okay. We had more snow last winter than I remember getting the whole time I've been here in 30 years. And we got the third coldest winter ever, right? So what's the problem? Well, actually, that's not inconsistent with a warming climate, because what we find is that as the air temperature increases, it can hold more moisture in it, more water. So as we're having warmer temperatures, even if they're in the wintertime, they're holding more water. And then when we do have a cold event, it triggers a greater amount of precipitation that occurs. So it increases the severity of those storms. The other thing is, and this is the one that's really scary, at least for me trying to get a garden to recover over here from a severe winter, is that we see as we have increasing temperatures, it disturbs the polar vortex. And a few years ago, we all heard that fact that you're going to have less of a buffer for storm damage that comes in and can wreak havoc. We're also creating salt intrusion areas that will impact our water sources along the coastal environments, decreasing the quality of the irrigation water available. And you might say a lot of us, it's no big deal. We're not present along coast, but the truth is we are a coastal country. 40% of our population lives in counties that are adjacent to the ocean and coast. That means that we're really susceptible to increased quantities of tropical storms. One of the main forecasts that most people can agree on is an increasing level of severe storms in the Gulf Basin and Atlantic Basin. This is data from 1850 all the way to 2015. You can see a steady increase in the amount of total hurricanes and strong tropical storms that are occurring, and in particular in the last 20 years or so, a much greater likelihood. We got another dose of that, of course, in Louisiana during this past week. What's the implications for the plants we use in the landscapes and how we design our landscapes? They have to be able to withstand flooding, they have to be able to withstand salinity, and they have to be able to withstand high winds that are there as well. One of the best things we can do to try and reduce the impacts of storms is to restore our riparian areas and our coastal environments. These are going to become major factors in protecting the built environment and increasing its resiliency over time. This is the biggest protector against storm surge that we have, are this and the estuaries that surround the coastal environment. A lot of open opportunities for research in restoration ecology for those areas. Another emphasis is, unfortunately, those severe storms are not likely to be confined specifically to the coast. So what's that mean as we go forward? We have to have trees that are not only having good structural branching, the nurseries need to be setting them up for good scaffold branching as they're selling them, and we need to have arboriculture industry that is able to go through and reduce some of the sale capacity from these trees in order to reduce their likelihood for failure. People may say, well, as long as it's not us that's getting the drought, or if we're getting a little drought, we can just move Western plants in and take care of it. Well, it's that variability that's going to be a wild card. Does anybody recognize this? Anybody was in class? You got to do a forensic identification here, right? Sodal, good. Okay, maybe Jonathan will pass. We've got to, this is sodal and this is desert spoon. There was a big push when we had the drought period here to move a lot of warm climate plants in. What we're finding is, though, this one had a particularly wet winter and spring. And what we had was fungal pathogens set up extensively in the growing points of these. Once you lose the growing points, that's it, it's gone, okay? So that makes it a little tricky. One of the other comments that you often hear is that, well, we've had changes in climate over eons and the plants move around. We have relictual populations all over. The plants will move themselves. Well, that may be true when we're looking at a geologic scale, but with the scale and the speed with which we're experiencing climate change is unprecedented pretty much in historical levels. So it's unlikely that the natural migration of plants will be unable to keep up with things. There's also an added concern as we start to design our landscapes is that we don't create pools of potentially invasive species or aggressive native species that as climate change weakens our natural ecosystems in the surrounding areas, they become pools for sources of invasion to those areas. So the only good thing I can say is that sometimes that climatic changes are just as hard on the invasive exotics And if you look around town or around our region, we've had the Chinese tallow and the China berry take some hits and seem to be being stopped a little bit in their invasion. So maybe there's hope. I want to kind of pose think about a philosophical question here. Do you like my Blair Witch photography here where we're going? But look at all the beautiful pollinators that we have on this. This is black mangrove down in the South Texas. And this is a rather large stand of it. Black mangrove is very good at holding soil and supports a large native ecosystem. The challenge is that black mangrove was native only to very small locations in South Texas, very near the coast. We're seeing it now migrating up the coast all the way to Corpus Christi in the central part and beyond. And so is this an invasive species, or is this simply a native species that's taking advantage of that changing environment? It certainly is changing the ecosystem in those areas. Okay? So just a question as we move forward, is every native species good as well? Well, I've given you reason to go home and pour a tall one and kind of console yourself. That was good because Ohio State plays tonight. I'm going to go home and watch that after I give a talk at Ringer Library. Okay, but we've got a whole lot of criteria that we now can look at and use as things that we're trying to screen for, plants that we're trying to find abilities to withstand these various stresses or concerns. And public gardens are a perfect place for repositories for large volume of genetic material to be able to screen for this, and also for us to be able to actually do some breeding work in. Now, all this, and I want to make some suggestions of things we can do to make our environment more resilient in the built environment. One of these is to embrace diversity. We can embrace diversity in a lot of ways, but I like Dr. Santamore's comments from ringing back from, I remember him doing these in the 70s and 80s, and everybody was kind of laughing at him at the time in the sense that, what's the urgency? He was looking at no more than 5% of our urban canopies being one species, no more than 10% one genus, and no more than 15% a given family. Okay. And if you're feeling lucky and want to take more risk, you can double those. Bottom line is that College Station's campus is highly in violation of this rule. Okay. So we want to embrace that diversity. That way, if we lose a given group of plants due to environmental pressures, disease, insects, et cetera, it doesn't destroy the integrity of our designs. We want to become cognizant of provenance, and I've mentioned this 2 or 3 times. There was a study done in Europe, a couple of them, and believe it or not, as refined as Europeans are on their taste in plants, over half of the nurserymen had no idea where their genetic materials came from that they were selling. And those that did know, very few of them knew below a country level. Okay. So I would suspect that it's even worse here where we're not as cognizant of some of that. And that's something that we need to do to increase the ability for us to plant plants that will not only handle today's environment, but those that might be encountered in the future. Preservation of the coastal and riparian ecosystems and their restoration are areas that we can reach out and work on. There's a lot of work that's being done in Europe now on built environments in, for instance, Vienna and some of the areas where you have a lot of low-lying buildings, and that along the canals of Venice and things. And they're working at trying to save those systems and natural through the use of natural ecosystems to buffer the impact on some of the built environment. There's a move towards low impact development. Low impact development features are very diverse, from rain gardens to bioswales to detention areas to green roofs to living walls. All of the gist of this is to try and minimize runoff, maximize infiltration into the groundwater systems, and also to tie up carbon, and of course, to help filter our air and runoff that's occurring. This is a major movement in the landscape and architecture and planning areas, and is something that we can begin to demonstrate in some of our public gardens and provide some knowledge and advice to our clientele. We also want to recognize and exploit microclimates. If we're going to have to live with some of these changes that are occurring, why not embrace some of that and use them to grow some things that might not have been there already? So make lemons out of your lemonade, or no, make lemonade out of your lemons. That's a senior moment there. Never mind. Okay. The other thing is to accept the dynamic nature of gardens. I've always argued that, one, we have the garden maturing as it gets older and more mature, but we seem to want to paint a picture with our gardens instead of embracing the fact that they change dynamically throughout each year and throughout the year. And so I will tell you that I only have irrigation around the base of the foundation of my house. I do not have irrigation out in the turf or in the other areas of the lawn. Brown is a color too, okay? And in Texas, much of our native areas, other than this summer when it stayed pretty green, most winters or most summers will turn a brown color. And so I embrace that. We try and plant plants in there that will withstand those natural conditions. And by the way, my yard is full of post oaks and they're perfectly happy. And it's because I don't try and water them like you've got St. Augustine turf underneath of them. Okay. So we got to embrace some of the dynamic nature of gardens, and we've got to reject little pink houses. Now, does anybody know where little pink houses come from? Yeah. Betsy, no, y'all got to listen to more music. Okay. John Mellencamp, the Little Pink Houses for You and Me. And it's all about having the American dream, and we're all got this cookie cutter mentality. What we want to do is make sure that we are creating landscapes in our homes and in our cities that are recognizing the fact that by having diversity, by not trying to change the native environment so much, we have a much better ecosystem that's embracing the native flora and fauna. And you got to plant some plants that you let the bugs eat a little bit, because those bugs are going to turn into butterflies. And also they're going to be the food that fuels the songbirds that you're enjoying. So you've got to embrace a more holistic approach to the landscape. Or we could go like this. Okay. I do have that on my bucket list. I want to go see that sometime just because it's so unusual, but that really is a garden. And I want to invite y'all to come to what I think is the most beautiful classroom in Texas and visit us at the gardens. I will say also, it's been a banner week for our gardens. We have been officially put on the capital campaign for the 20-acre expansion. So we're looking forward to actually moving into the development phase of that and moving forward with it. And we also have all gotten our folks back. We had people out there with drones taking promotional pictures for their clubs and that. I thought, how far have we come when I can go out in the garden and they've got people doing designs on the ground and photographing it from a drone. And think back a year from now, we were all shut in our houses and afraid to even go over to the neighbor's house and say hello. And now we're coming back to normal. We're not there, but we're getting there. So I'll leave you with that. And I'll also say, okay, I'm looking forward to Gerald telling us about the human impacts for resiliency. And we've seen a lot of that in the gardens this year. It's been a place for people to come and renew themselves. And so I'll let Gerald kind of set you up for that the next time around. Okay. Thank you. And I just want to personally express my thanks to Trish. Man, thank you for taking over for Dan and carrying us into when Amit's here. And I'll bet you didn't think you were signing up for flooded buildings and broken greenhouse roofs. And man, Dan, do you know the timing? So I'm going to talk to you about when I go to retire. It's all the climate. Yeah, I hate to say it, but it is real, and we're experiencing a lot of this. And so we have to find ways to be resilient. Great. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity.